Hello everyone, peace be upon you all. Welcome to video number 12 where we analyze the demonstration of deceit and getting to know who are the Jahmis. First of all, now we are going to learn the major doctrines by Jahm, starting with number A. Knowledge and ignorance refer to corporeal real existent things only. This implies that it does not refer to incorporeal things, does not refer to God. So I cannot know or not know God, because God is not a thing, is not a corporeal thing. So this is a quotation from the Maqalat by Al-Ash'ari. So this is by Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. He says, Jahm said, God's knowledge is temporally originated. It has started to exist in time. It did not exist, then it started to exist. He has brought it into temporal existence, with the result that he knew by it. So, as a result of his creation of his knowledge, he knew. It is something other than God. End quote. The quote of Jah. According to him, it is possible that God knows all particular things prior to their existence, by a knowledge which he brings into existence prior to them. But someone reports of him the opposite of this. Scholars did not care about Jahm ibn Safwan enough to note down his opinions and pass them down to next generations. Rather, these are unauthoritative reports, unlike prophetic traditions, for example, which people gave a lot of care. So, this other person, he claims that he has been told that Jahm used to say, quote, God knows a thing in the state of its origination, at the moment of its origination, not prior to it. It is absurd that a thing is object of knowledge and non-existent. It cannot be non-existent and be an object of knowledge. So God's knowledge is originated. It originates with the origination of the object. This is the implication or the interpretation of what he said, not what he said. So the first quotation is an interpretation of the second quotation, not an actual doctrine, not an actual thing that Jahm said. And we continue. Al-Ash'ari says, because thing, according to him, is the existent body, and that which is not existent is not a thing, so that knowledge or ignorance of it would be possible. So a thing prior to its existence is not a thing, so that it could be an object of knowledge or ignorance. It is not a thing in the first place. Then Jahm's opponents forced him to acknowledge, as a consequence of his aforementioned premise, that God has a temporally originated knowledge, because he claimed that God first had not been knowing and then knew. Given his premise that only the existent body can be object of knowledge, he necessarily must say that which he says with regard to knowledge, with regard to power and life as well. In contrast to hostile Hanbali sources, Al-Ash'ari tries to do justice to Jahm's thesis and to reconstruct his thesis from a neutral point of view. He reports an alleged reductio ad absurdum. A reductio ad absurdum is to reduce someone's belief to an absurd belief, to argue that someone's belief imply an absurd belief. So he reports an alleged reductio ad absurdum of three of Jahm's assumptions by adversaries. The external form of the narrative does not unambiguously distinguish between Jahm's suppositions and the consequences Jahm's adversaries drew from them. However, by comparison with further accounts of Jahm's doctrines, it becomes evident that the first paragraph of the report refers to the consequence Jahm's opponents drew from the theses assigned to Jahm in the second paragraph, not to Jahm's actual doctrine. Other sources unambiguously report that Jahm did not hold that God's knowledge is something other than God, but just the opposite, that God's knowledge and God is the same thing, they are identical. CD, we are in A. The report explains that adversaries of Jahm argued that his following suppositions are untenable. What are his suppositions? 1. God knows a thing in the state of its origination. 2. Thing is the existent body. 3. What is non-existent is not a thing and not knowable. Jahm's opponents argue that from these premises follows God's knowledge is temporally originated. 5. God first had not been knowing and then knew. These consequences are inconsistent with the logical postulate that God does not undergo substantial or qualitative change. This is a doctrine that is held by all Muslim philosophers and theologians. The point in dispute here is whether and how God knows the world. Does God know corporeal particular things or intelligible universal things or both? Jahm's opponents argued that on condition that he refused that God's knowledge refers to immaterial objects prior to the existence of material objects, as a consequence, he had to admit that God's knowledge depends on material objects like our knowledge. They claimed that Jahm had to admit that God's knowledge is empirical, based on induction, since material objects are generated because every composite thing is generated. God's knowledge, creative power, and activity would also be generated. This would imply that God's state of being changes. Before the generation of the generated, he would be unknowing, and then at the time of the generation of the generated, his knowledge would originate. According to Jahm and his adversaries, knowledge and ignorance need an object to which they refer. Knowledge is always knowledge of a thing, i.e., the correlative of knowledge which must exist together with it. There is no knowledge of that which does not exist. According to Jahm's second supposition, existent body is the description of thing. He maintains that besides corporeal things, there are no knowables. What does not exist at some particular time, at some particular place, and is without qualities, i.e., what is either non existent or God, is indescribable, and therefore cannot be object of knowledge and ignorance. The question is how Jahm's two further suppositions have to be understood. Jahm's opponents obviously took the first supposition in the sense of God knows a thing at the time of its origination, and the third supposition in the sense of what is yet non-existent is not a thing and not knowable. Their approach is temporal, and only from this aspect Jahm's three suppositions lead to the conclusions of the opponents in the dispute reported above. Probably they were people who affirmed the eternity of the things together with their Creator, and held that God is knowing the things from eternity. They argued on the basis of the contradiction between being knowing from eternity and being knowing by origination that Jahm maintained that God's knowledge is temporally generated. But Jahm neither maintained that God is knowing from eternity nor by origination, and he probably understood the first supposition of the above quoted report in the sense of God knows a thing in the condition of its origination. في حال حدوثه, in the condition of its origination, i.e., what it is and how it is when it exists, namely which properties belong to it at the time when it exists, without reference to past, present, or future. Further, Jam probably understood the third supposition in the sense of what never exists, i.e., what did not exist, does not exist, and will not exist in extramental reality, is not knowable and not a thing. Under these conditions, Jam held that God knows all particular things of all times without relation to the time of their temporal origination. Mu'tazilite opponents of Jam's doctrine made use of the term thing, not only for corporeals but also for immaterial things, namely substances, accidents, activities, and their classes, like the classes of colors, movements, tastes, etc. Abad ibn Sulaiman, a major Mu'tazilite, affirmed that these things are objects of God's knowledge and objects of God's power prior to the creation of particular composite bodies. So God has a priori knowledge of these objects before their creation. In contrast, Jahm refused the reality of universal substances, accidents, and activities. These things that are immaterial, he rejected their existence. That's one. Secondly, he considered them as mere thoughts and concepts, and epistemologically posterior to the sensible qualities and activities of corporeals. So they can only be known posterior or after the creation of these objects. For him, thought and reality in his system are opposed. They cannot be thoughts and be real. And with that, reach the end of the video. Thank you for watching and see you next time.